Hello, and welcome back to the Storied Human. Today I'm interviewing Ruthann Harper. She's a psychologist working in the UK. She specializes in narcissism. She works with people who identify as narcissists themselves. She also works with people who have a narcissistic parent or other relative or ex. And she does work with couples where one or both are narcissists. So she's become quite the specialist in narcissism since the pandemic. Isn't that right?
Yeah, so I went back to work after maternity leave during the pandemic and kind of fell into working with a few people who had quite narcissistic tendencies and got a lot of specialist training and supervision in that area, and seems to be what I do. And it's been quite a surprisingly enlivening and quite challenging and quite fun experience, actually, in lots of ways.
And I was very struck. We met on a podcast Facebook group, and I was asking for guests. And I was very struck that you related some of your work to a story, because I'm all about the story. Can you tell me more about that story?
Well, the story of Narcissus, it's an ancient Greek myth. And I think it's something we've kind of forgotten about. When you hear about narcissism in popular culture, you kind of hear this big insult. It's used as a very pejorative term. And I think a lot of us have forgotten this story. It's a really human story. And I think if you really slow down and listen to it, you might even recognize bits of yourself in the story. So the story is Narcissus he's the child of a rape. And his father's a river god. And his mother is very concerned about him and wanting him to have a long life. So she seeks advice. And the advice she has is that her son will live a long life so long as he doesn't see himself. And so his mother takes great pains to make sure he never sees himself. So Narcissus doesn't really know who he is. He's got no real sense of who he is, what he's about, his character, his personality. And he is extremely physically attractive and a very skilled huntsman. And people, men and women, fall madly in love with them, and he rejects them all. Until one day he stumbles across a lake, and in the lake he sees his own reflection. And he falls madly in love with his reflection. And his reflection, of course, he doesn't, people think Narcissus falls in love with himself. He doesn't know himself. He has no idea who he is. All he has is this image, this reflection onto which he projects his fantasy of his ideal lover. And of course, every time he tries to grasp his love, the picture distorts and the waters ripple, and it's a horrifying sight. And then he steps back, the picture comes back, and eventually Narcissus spends his life there until he falls into the lake and drowns, only to emerge as a narcissus plant, which we know as the daffodil.
It is an amazing story. I revisited after you mentioned it, and I love the part where it says he even leans down and tries to kiss the image because he's so struck by its beauty. But I'm just also amazed that it's so applicable. It's so psychologically savvy.
Mm-hmm.
There it is. And Echo too. Poor Echo.
Well, this is the thing that, I think a lot of people know the story of Narcissus to some extent, but they don't realize the original story was never Narcissus's story. The story was Echo and Narcissus. And how apt that we've all forgotten Echo. So Echo she's a nymph. She's a garden nymph. She's young. She's full of youth. She's beautiful. She's got lots of energy. And the gods like to come to Earth to play with the nymphs because they have a great time with them. And Zeus comes to Earth and he's playing with Echo's friends. And Zeus's wife, Hera, gets suspicious. And so she decides to visit Earth to see what Zeus is up to. And Echo sees her coming and distracts her. So she chats to her, basically to keep her from finding out what her husband is up to. And Hera, realizing what Echo has done, is absolutely incensed, and she curses her. And rather than take away her voice so she can't chat, she takes away her ability to say anything apart from the last words she's heard spoken. So echo can only echo. And then Echo comes across Narcissus, and like so many others before her, falls madly in love with Narcissus, and all Echo can do is repeat back to Narcissus the last words he's spoken. So, hello, hello, who's there? Who's there? Love you. Love you.
Yeah. Doomed.
And basically she's doomed, and eventually there's various tellings of the story, but eventually Narcissus becomes angry with her, rejects her, and she runs away to the caves where we only ever hear her as an echo.
It's just so clever and so right on. You know, it's just sort of amazing to me that they knew human psychology so well so long ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we still use that word.
We use narcissism. We don't use... Echoism is making a little bit of a wave at the moment. There's been some discussion about the concept of echoism, which is the idea that there are some people who would rather be invisible.
Oh, how interesting.
Would like not to share their own story and will live in the shadow of someone else's story.
That fits.
Let someone else dominate. Yeah. So Craig Malkin is the psychologist who's kind of pushed that concept. It's a really interesting idea. It's like almost not enough narcissism. Like there's not enough ego. There's not enough sense of yourself and your ability to achieve things and influence things and to tell your own story and to speak your own mind. And so he talks about people having a fear of being narcissistic to such an extent that they let everyone else take the limelight and they never, ever want to be center stage.
And, you know, if you think about it, you know people like that.
Who doesn't know someone like that? And who doesn't know someone who falls in the other category?
We do. We run into all kinds of varying degrees of narcissist. I think that's what's been so interesting talking a little bit with you, that, you know, we don't understand there's a spectrum and that a little bit of narcissism is not so bad, right? A little bit of narcissism.
It's really interesting. It's interesting where the concept of narcissism came from. So the first person to use the term narcissism was actually a sex therapist.
Ooh.
And he, I forgot his name. Do you want me to look it up? What was his name? Havelock. His name was Havelock. And he had patients who were basically smothering themselves in kisses and masturbating, and he referred to them as narcissists because they were wildly in love with themselves. And then quite astoundingly, good old Sigmund Freud came along and desexualized the concept. And he talked about narcissism as being this normal ego state in childhood, where a child feels powerful and they feel capable and competent, and they're centered on themselves and their ability to exert influence on the world. And that it's only as a child grows and develops and learns how to relate to other people, learns how to yield a little bit of their ego to someone else and give love away as well as receive it, that they lose their narcissism or becomes where they're able to relate. There's a beautiful quote from Freud, and I don't normally agree with much of what Freud says, but he said, "He who loves becomes humble."
So true. It's a lovely quote.
Yeah.
So what goes wrong? Like, it sounds like if you accept that it might be a natural phase, right? And that children do learn to care for others. How do they get stuck there?
Well, I mean, Freud would have argued that if you don't get the love back, if you don't have that reciprocity with the caregiver, if you give out your love and you get nothing back, you take it all back into yourself. And that's what kind of develops narcissism. And then the concept evolved a lot throughout the 20th century. And there's two big names, Heinz Kohut and Otto Kernberg. Otto Kernberg's still alive, still very influential in the field. But it's really interesting because when Heinz Kohut was developing his concept of narcissism, he was influenced by Freud and the concept that it was a healthy stage of human development. And he kind of thought of it as being, he was working in private practice with wealthy people in Vienna at the turn of the 20th century. And, it was a thriving society. There were lots of arts, there was lots of creativity, there were lots of performers, lots of big egos. And he kind of thought about narcissism as long as you have your narcissism in check, it's okay. There may be some good aspects to it. He didn't pathologize it so much. He could recognize that there were ways in which people's narcissism could get out of hand and cause them problems, cause them to be very selfish, very egotistical, maybe even quite cruel to other people, unable to admit their own flaws, unable to acknowledge their own mistakes. But he certainly held on to a concept that there was a level of narcissism that could be healthy. But then only a couple of decades later, of course, Vienna has changed. There's now the threat of the Third Reich and Nazism in Europe. And Otto Kernberg, who was working in Vienna at that time with, again, a different patient group. He wasn't working with the kind of wealthy private practice patients. And he developed more of the concept of dark narcissism. So narcissism really is pathology, as selfishness, as cruel, as dark, as potentially leading to abusive behavior. And so he emphasized that angle on it much more. And I think that's influenced our popular conception of narcissism. Although I am seeing now a few different people like Craig Malkin and Keith Campbell, and also another one I read recently, Laurie Helgo, where they're kind of looking at, there are aspects of narcissism in the sense of, and it's so important to see narcissism on a spectrum. Mm-hmm. And at the extreme end, you can have way too much narcissism. You can have, you can be very egotistical, very self-centered, although it's interesting where that comes from. We can talk about that as well, because it's not what it seems on the surface. It is the fantasy, it's the grandiose image that's being presented. But they're kind of talking about some level of positive view of yourself, maybe even slightly rose-tinted glasses where you see yourself as just a little bit more capable than you really are, just a little bit, have a nice positive spin on yourself. And that not necessarily being a bad thing, because it gives you a drive and it makes you feel competent and it makes you pursue the things that you want to pursue. But if you have a healthy level of narcissism, what you can do is take feedback on board without being crushed or without becoming defensive. So you can take it on board, you can reflect on it, you can grow and develop, and you can make use of it. And what you can also do in healthy narcissism is, yes, you have big ambitions and big goals, but the goals are the goals for their own sake. It's not, I have to achieve this in order to be an acceptable person, or I have to achieve this in order to prove that I'm superior to other people. And actually what those kind of more healthy narcissists do is they bring other people with them. And they can be quite collaborative in their narcissism. And when we talked before, I talked about, I had a boss very early on in my career who, in retrospect, I think, there was quite a bit of entitlement. He viewed himself as above the hospital rules. He did what he pleased. always in the service of his patients. I mean, if I had the problem he treated, I would be very happy if he was the clinician treating me, because you would not get better. You could not get better care than what you got from him. And as someone he mentored and taught, you didn't get better teaching. You got a lot of his time, you got a lot of his input, and you got a few privileges flung your way because he made sure you got opportunities that other people maybe didn't get. He pulled a few strings. He stepped on a few feet.
It's more complex than I think a lot of us think of it. That's so interesting. Yeah. So when does it slide the other way? Like, when does it become abusive?
Yeah. So even pathological narcissism is not necessarily it's not about abuse. I think this is one of the sort of problems in the kind of current zeitgeist, is that we've come to see narcissism as purely associated with abuse. And not all abusers are narcissists. Not all narcissists are abusers. I mean, narcissism can certainly lead to or contribute to abuse. I'll talk about more what it is. If you think about narcissists as being in love with that fantasy image, I mean, that's what it is. It's So people who are very narcissistic, we know they're much more likely to have had a history of severe emotional neglect, physical abuse, even sexual abuse. And they don't have that core sense of themselves as I'm lovable and I'm worthy just for being me. What they have is a sense of, I have to be exceptional and extraordinary in order to be a worthwhile human being.
Ouch. Yeah, that's hard.
So they, when they're in a close, intimate relationship, in any close, intimate relationship, we hurt each other on occasion.
Yeah.
You're a little bit selfish. You're a little neglectful.
Right. You trample on someone's feelings and don't even realize it. Right. People make mistakes.
Yeah. And any healthy relationship involves a good level of repair, where you have to acknowledge how you've affected each other, see it. Doesn't have to get out of hand. It doesn't have to be much more in a lot of cases than simply acknowledging it, just acknowledging it and apologizing and understanding each other and cutting each other, cutting each other a bit of slack and giving each other a bit of grace and forgiveness. There's a lot of that in a healthy relationship. But someone who's strongly narcissistic can't do that, because that means I have to admit I made a mistake. I'm not perfect. I'm not superhuman after all. I'm as flawed and vulnerable as the next person. So rather than say, I'm sorry, I hold my hand up. Well, no, you did it. Your fault. You made me do it. Oh, what are you complaining about? It's no big deal anyway. So, and that's where they can become very neglectful, very critical, very condescending partners. Or in any relationship, in the workplace, same thing. As a parent, the same thing. And as parents, they may really struggle with their child's weakness and vulnerabilities, because they may view the child as a reflection on them.
Oh my gosh.
Which is a lot of pressure, potentially, on the child.
It's really tough. It can be very tough to have a parent that way. I've seen that with friends of mine. Whew.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important. What you can help people with is understanding that there's a lot of shades of this, because in popular culture, it's just like narcissist equals bad,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and it's also narcissist equals grandiose. And grandiose, and this is the interesting thing, because I know you said it's a lot of men. I'm like, classical narcissism is more prevalent in men. What we think of as narcissism, grandiose narcissism.
Yeah.
But I think there's now a recognition that narcissism presents in different ways. And you can have what's called vulnerable narcissism, which can be more, or covert narcissism. They're slightly different concepts, but it's more like I get my specialness and my sense of superiority by being the person who sacrificed the most,
being the martyr,
the most, being the martyr.
Oh my gosh, that's so classically women, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the more narcissistic presentation in women. Or you also get what's called the communal narcissist, which is I'm the most charitable, giving person in the room.
My gosh.
So, and I'm the most empathic. I'm the most kindest person. So it can take different forms. And I think the other thing I think is really helpful to think about narcissism is it's a way of regulating self-esteem. And so what you'll find is someone who's very narcissistic will swing between feeling like on top of the world, the most special, amazing person, one moment, to utter self-loathing and worthlessness the next.
Whoa.
And you'll often see as well a big discrepancy between the narcissist who is in public, the CEO who's like, look at me, I'm the center of the universe, I'm so amazing. Behind closed doors at home, do you think people like me? Do you think they think I'm useless? Do you think, that actually really questioning themselves, but you don't see that vulnerability?
So it's never enough, really, right? For those people.
No.
It's just never enough.
No. And I think a lot of it, of course, is because it's the pursuit of a fantasy.
Right.
It's the pursuit of an ideal. It's the image in the water.
No,
and that you...
Right. Oh, image in the water. That's so true. Back to the myth.
It's back to the myth. It's the image in the water that you can never truly grasp. And what I'll often say to the kind of narcissistic people I work with is like, well, what you're going to have to do is have a real relationship. So, you can have this fantasy that you and your partner are like some sort of superpower couple. But actually, the reality is you're both flawed human beings. Do you want to have the experience of accepting each other as you are?
Yeah, that's at the heart of it. Yeah.
With a few rough edges on occasion.
Yeah. If you just chase a fantasy, you're going to always be disappointed. And that just sounds to me like, I don't know if this is really related, but people always say, like, once you become aware of your ego, you realize that nothing will ever be enough for your ego. So you have to be aware. You have to say, no, I choose this life. But the ego, if you're not aware of it, will always whisper in your ear, well, you could use a bigger house, or you could be thinner, or are you successful enough? You're not really making enough money. There's always a whisper. Mm-hmm. You could have more, you could be more, and that kind of life is a desperate life, a reactive kind of, you're reacting to the ego telling you you're just not enough.
And it's also a very restless life.
Yeah.
Because there's no ability to just be like, I'm going to enjoy this. I'm going to enjoy the home I have, even if it's modest.
That's so wonderful, though, to reach that point. And I think there is like a tendency of people now to talk about mindfulness, and to talk about taking a breath, and to talk about appreciating what they have, and to just get quiet. More people are meditating. I mean, I'm hoping that it's, turning, that people are saying, well, this is not healthy, to constantly be chasing.
Although then some people will chase the being the most spiritual person in the room.
Oh, that's right.
So the ego can turn wherever you go, your ego may get you.
You have to be really careful. It's so true.
Yeah.
You're just the most virtuous, or the most new age, or the most, spiritual. You have to be really careful. You have to check in on.
Yeah. I really like the kind of concept of self-compassion for narcissists. Like, it's like, and I'll often say to them, I wish you knew you were okay as you are.
Oh, I love that.
Your house is okay. Your home is okay. Your job is okay. Your partner is okay. Not perfect, but okay. And that's okay. You don't have to be perfect. And actually being able to accept yourself as you are, and being able to tolerate that you have some weaknesses, actually means that it actually makes you less permissive with yourself, because you're able to be like, actually, I'm really hurting myself. I'm hurting myself by losing my temper and shouting at my partner and blaming her for everything. Or I'm hurting myself by using lots of alcohol and substances to cope with my emotions, rather than acknowledge that I feel really terrible about something. These are things that are hurting me. It actually gives you the courage to face those things.
Yeah.
Because you're not crushed. You're like, I'm still a worthwhile person. I'm a worthwhile person with these really big struggles with my ego.
I think that's lovely. I mean, it just seems to me it must become a habit, just constantly picking at yourself, constantly driving yourself to do something else, to be the best. It must be exhausting.
Oh, yeah. No, it is I think that's the tragedy of kind of pathological narcissism, is the ego's never satisfied. So it's constant pursuit of more. Or it's being frozen because what you can achieve is never enough.
It's all too much. It paralyzes you. Yeah.
Yeah. So I can't, I don't see this so much because I work in private practice, but I've certainly come across where someone's like, I can't take this job because it's not a good enough job. I can't take this relationship because it's not a good enough relationship. I'm going to wait till something brilliant comes along. But actually, well, what are you doing? Nothing. Yeah. You'd be far better off to do something and let things evolve in time and be satisfied. Be content.
This is I'm relating to this heavy duty because I'm looking for a job now, and I'm often looking for a job. because I'm a consultant, and I have to stop myself sometimes. I have to say that job is great and it's super big deal, and you're like too tired and too old to to restart that. Yes, it's wonderful, and wouldn't you feel special if you had that job? But it's really not what fits your lifestyle right now. It's really, there's a lot of shiny objects,
But to me, that's a perfect example of self-compassion, because you're able to say, hang on, what do I need? Yeah. So my ego and my self-esteem might really like to have that big, impressive consultant job. But you know what? I have other things in my life that are just maybe even a little more important to me.
That took years. I mean, I'd fall for that high money, won't I be a big deal? I've fallen for that a lot in my life. And now I say, I know what that high money means. It means misery and long hours.
Yeah.
And not being treated well, usually. That's sort of what goes along with the whole, because I work in information technology, so it's kind of brutal. It's a young person's game, and it's very competitive and lots of layoffs, and it's a crazy world. So but it's funny, we were talking, I'm part of a podcasting group. We all took a course together, and we talk a lot about mindfulness and about how you should treat yourself the way you should treat a really good friend. Like somebody said, well, what would you say to a friend who was in that position? And usually you'd be more compassionate to that friend. Well, why can't you be like that to yourself? What would you say to a friend? That has been so simple but useful for me to remind myself, well, I would give that person a break. Why aren't I giving myself a break?
Yeah.
It's just really good to revisit these things.
Yeah.
Well, my sense is that you help a lot of people.
Well, I try.
Yeah. You're making a lot of sense today.
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like us to know, like that you wish more people knew about narcissism?
I think I wish people knew narcissism was not there's lots of things I wish people knew. I wish they knew it wasn't a disorder of excessive self-love. There's no such thing as too much self-love.
Okay.
Not if it's genuine. Not if it's I genuinely love and care about myself. Not if it's like I'm the best person in the room. Of course, that's that can cause problems for you. But it really is a disorder of self-loathing and worthlessness.
Man,
and it's all compensation.
Yeah, you would never guess.
You never guess.
That's fascinating. So it's really that you hate yourself, and you can never do enough to remedy that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That sounds like a curse, like a modern day Greek curse to me.
Yeah. Well, and it's also like, the Greek curse was never to know yourself. And I think, I look at the kind of narcissists I work with, the people who identify as narcissists, and they've often had these very harsh childhoods with very demanding parents. They've often not had a lot of love, not had a lot of warmth, not had a lot of nurturing. They have to strive to be okay. And I just wish you knew you were okay. And they'll say, that's not good enough for me. That's not enough for me to be okay. Don't patronize me with that crap.
Oh my gosh.
It's really hard. And I often have to remind myself, like, this is a little boy or a little girl underneath this.
Oh yes. What a wonderful way to look at it.
Yeah, but I know I do sometimes ask them to give me a photograph of when they were little.
Aww.
So I can, when they're really pushing a few buttons of mine, I can look at the photo.
I love that.
Yeah. That's
the compassion that you have for them. Yeah. Yeah. I know it gets like that with people, like in a competitive society, people are so ridiculous. Like, oh, I don't want to be normal. There's that feeling like, I don't want to be normal. I want to be high achieving. I want to be like a big deal. I want to be successful at any price.
But we can't all be. But this is the thing. It's like that requires everyone to be extraordinary. And we can't all be extraordinary.
No, we're not all
society would not function if everyone was extraordinary. We couldn't function if everyone was the CEO. There would be no company.
That's a very good point. We need everybody.
Yeah. And I think the other thing, another thing I wish people really knew about narcissism was it's not, I mean, there is pathological narcissism, there is a disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, which is a disorder of narcissism. But that's not all there is to narcissism. We all have narcissism within us to some extent. And we all need a bit, because the other extreme is echo, and who we're not talking about, because no one ever talks about echo.
Poor echo.
But like we all do that, don't we? We all on occasion have our egos get carried away. We all get, I always think if you have something that's just really special to you, really precious, and someone insults it, oh my God, the defensiveness comes out, doesn't it?
Yes.
Someone insults your podcast. How dare you?
I would not be happy.
Yeah, you react, and it's like, we all do that, or we all have like sort of buttons that we don't want to be pressed, things that we are sensitive about because it's too painful to go there. And so we protect ourselves, maybe by being defensive or condescending or putting someone down or bigging ourselves up to be seen as a little bit more superior than we really are.
Yeah. And we negate. When I get in those modes, I realize later that I negated maybe some good advice that would have been helpful, but I couldn't hear it.
Yeah. That's and really potentially harmed a relationship.
Yeah, it's probably true about me and a lot of people I know. So there are threads of narcissism like running through a lot of people, and it's even a necessary thing. Or we, like you said, we would never push ourselves forward, maybe.
Yeah, well, and it's like, if you think about, you can define narcissism as well as like an ordinary human desire to feel special. And if you didn't have that, particularly younger people, people get less narcissistic generally with age. And that's the overall pattern. But, in younger people, you do kind of need that little bit of a oomph to put yourself out there to, I
remember that thinking like, I'm not going to be like my parents. I'm going to do better than my parents. I'm not going to have that kind of job. Yeah, that kind of like the callowness of youth, right?
Yeah, and I don't think it can have a bad effect taken to extremes, but on some level, it's also necessary.
It is necessary.
Where would we be if nobody had any ego, if nobody had any narcissism at all? Would we have the progress we have in science and technology, in the arts and creativity? Would we have it if no one was prepared to be like, I'm going to do this better than anyone who's done it before?
Yeah. That does lead to some amazing breakthroughs. I'm not sure we sort of need everybody. We just don't need the extremes, right? We don't need those extreme narcissists.
Yeah. Or the extremes need to come with some balance.
Yeah. This has been amazing. I am really grateful that you're doing this kind of work, because I think a lot of people really need it. And I think
do you want to talk about echo?
Oh yes, I'd love to talk about echo.
Because we shouldn't ignore her.
No, it's important.
Because I often think about echo as being the person who sits on the sidelines and who doesn't have their own story or doesn't tell their own story because they can't speak it. There's something that holds them back. And, I have, particularly when I work with people who come out of quite abusive relationships, what they often don't, they often don't know who they often say, I don't even know who I am.
So they're like echo.
They're like echo. And in some ways, that lack of ego, that lack of knowing yourself and liking yourself and being willing to put yourself forward and out there can leave you sitting in other people's shadows. And that can leave you quite vulnerable to someone who is quite happy to have you in their shadow.
To be that way. We've all known, especially women who are like that. I've known several women in my life who are like that. Or they become like that. They just sort of, they were young when they met someone. The person, he seemed dashing and charming and very strong personality. And then something, sort of goes awry and he becomes dominant and she forgets who she is or doesn't know who she is.
Yeah. And what I also find as well with those kind of echo issues. I don't know what the right word is. The sort of more, that sort of personality of being in the shadows and being sort of withdrawn. And particularly in the survivors of abuse, what I sometimes will find is that they almost have this focus on narcissism now. It's the narcissist. And I'm like, if you look at that sort of picture of Echo and Narcissus at the pole, and Echo's gazing at him longingly, I'm like, you're still gazing at him.
Oh, there's two sides. Yeah.
You might be it may have been that at one time you gazed at him in desire, and now you gaze at him in disgust and loathing, but you're still gazing at him.
Yeah.
You got to get up and walk around, and you got to discover. You got to have the courage to start discovering yourself.
So there's got to be changes on that side too.
Yeah.
Or you're just going to fall into the same thing again.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm like, get to know yourself. Explore. It can be a wonderful journey. It takes a lot of courage to do. You can start very small, but you got to explore. You got to try out things. You've got to see what you like, what you dislike, what surprises you. Explore lots of friendships, lots of relationships, and try out different patterns.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So that's the other side of it. Like where there's a narcissist, there's often an echo.
Yeah. Yeah. And both of them need to stop gazing at a reflection. I know we talked before about that scene in Harry Potter that was just like, oh, look, J.K. Rowling took a bit of Narcissus there, where Harry is looking in the mirror of Ersed, which is the mirror of desire. And Harry sees his family, and he can't take his eyes away from it. And Dumbledore tells him, grown men have starved to death looking in this mirror.
So perfect.
And it's like, we can let our fantasies actually rob us of all the good things in life.
That's so powerful, and it scares the heck out of me because so many people spend so much time on their computers, myself included. And there are days when I just have to pull myself off of it and get outside in the real world, like in the sunshine. Yeah. And I worry that maybe there's an imbalance, People are looking at content they can't take their eyes off of. It's an addictive kind of thing.
Yeah, well, if that content is, this is my fantasy of what I'm going to create and what I'm going to do, and I'm going to be amazing, and I'm like, no, you know what? You got to get out, you got to live, you're going to make mistakes, you're going to screw up. That's how you learn.
Warts and all, yeah.
Warts and all. And you're going to have to like and accept yourself, warts and all.
Yeah.
And your partner.
Yeah, we're not those polished, perfect people that we see.
No.
Yeah.
No.
All those people are striving to be, and it's a fantasy. Well, that was so fun. I can't even believe it. You gave so many interesting points about the myth, which I love, bringing that back into focus. And again, I'm amazed that the Greeks were so savvy. And also that narcissism is not necessarily one thing that's really bad. The spectrum is important to remember. So, Ruthann, you've given us a lot of food for thought, and I love it. Is there anything you'd like to wrap up with?
I think what I'd really like to get across is how much of a human thing narcissism is. It's not this out there thing that bad people have. It's part of all of us to some extent, and it's not even a bad part of all of us. And I kind of hope I hope this is a discussion that maybe provokes some thought, allows people to reflect a bit on themselves, allows people maybe to see narcissism in 3D rather than just the image of narcissism that we have all adopted to some extent. And maybe it makes for a bit more nuanced dialogue about it. Thank you so much for having me, because it's been really fun to talk to you and have the opportunity to come on your podcast.
It's so fun talking to you. Thanks for reaching out. And make sure that we're going to include in the show notes all of the people that you mentioned, all the psychologists that you mentioned. And if there's a place for people to contact you, if they have. So I can tell you a few things. I'll give you a link to all of the psychologists I mentioned and their books. And what I'll also do is I'll give you a link to my website. So I have a few things that people are interested in. I have my own YouTube channel. I'm on TikTok and Instagram, but I'm mostly on YouTube. Is the main, that's fantastic. Yeah.
find me. But obviously I have my private practice, but what I'm also doing now is developing some online courses for people who have, at the moment it's for people who've come out of abusive relationships. So people are very welcome to look those up and join me if they'd like. Connect with me on social media, say hello, and we can extend the conversation a bit.
How to connect with you? Well, I do include a lot of things in the show notes, so people don't always read the show notes. So
okay, so if you look up at Dr. Ruthann Harper, and Harper's Harpur on YouTube, Instagram, or TikTok, and my website is www.ruthannharper.co.uk.
Great.
So, no, and thank you so much, and thank you for letting me give myself a little narcissistic plug. This is my little putting myself out there.
I really appreciate it. It was interesting as heck.
Yeah. But I love this part of the internet, because I think it's what I love about podcasting is it's not narcissistic. It actually rubs that edge off, because it becomes a very collaborative thing, because you end up, I get to tell this story because you gave me a platform and facilitated that discussion. And your podcast kind of platforms that in a way. And so it's this very collaborative process where we have to cooperate. And I like this. This is what I love about this part of the internet and this part of social media at the moment is podcasting, because I think it's building genuine connection and much more nuanced conversation. And it also isn't putting one person as the guru above all others.
Yeah.
So it is this wonderfully collaborative space.
It's so fun to share. I just love sharing people's stories, and I learn so much. It's really a selfish endeavor, I have to say.
Oh, how lovely to have that.
Well, it all works out. All right. You take care.
Thank you so much.
And I really appreciate it.